The gunshot that echoed through Miles City, Montana, that scorching August afternoon in 1883, would haunt Henry Keller for the rest of his days, but not for the reason anyone might have expected. He was checking his horse's shoes outside the livery stable when he heard it, followed by screaming, and then he saw her for the first time. A woman with auburn hair streaming behind her like a banner, as three armed men dragged her toward waiting horses at the edge of town. Henry dropped the hoof pick and ran, his boots kicking up dust, but he was too far away. The woman fought like a wildcat, her dress tearing as she clawed at the men's faces, and he could hear her voice now, clear and defiant even in terror. "Let me go, you have no right." One of the men backhanded her hard enough that her head snapped to the side, and something primal ignited in Henry's chest. He reached for his revolver, but the distance was too great. There were too many townspeople in the way, panicking and scattering. By the time he had a clear line of sight, the riders were already thundering out of town with the woman thrown across one of their saddles. "Who is she?" Henry demanded, grabbing the arm of the nearest person, old Martin, who ran the general store. "Sarah Garrett," Martin said, his face pale. "She just arrived 2 weeks ago from St. Louis. She's been staying at the boarding house, teaching some of the children their letters. Those men, they said she witnessed something, some killing up north. Said she was coming with them whether she liked it or not." Henry's jaw clenched. He knew exactly who those men worked for. The Donovan gang had been terrorizing the territories between Montana and Dakota for months, rustling cattle, robbing stages, and worse. If they wanted Sarah Garrett badly enough to take her in broad daylight from a town with a sheriff, then she must have seen something that could hang them all. "Where's Sheriff Cooper?" Henry asked. Martin shook his head. "Rode out this morning to Helena. Won't be back for 3 days at least." 3 days. Henry looked at the dust cloud disappearing into the hills to the east. 3 days might as well be 3 years if those men decided Sarah Garrett was too much trouble to keep alive. He had served 2 years as a deputy in Abilene before drifting north, and he knew how men like the Donovans operated. Witnesses didn't last long. He ran to the boarding house, taking the steps 2 at a time. Mrs. Patterson, the landlady, was sitting in her parlor wringing her hands. "Mr. Keller, it was horrible. They just burst in, and which room was hers?" Henry interrupted. "Second floor, end of the hall, but he was already climbing the stairs. Sarah's room was small and neat, the bed carefully made, a few books stacked on the nightstand." He noticed immediately that she was educated. The books were volumes of poetry and philosophy, not the dime novels most folks read. On the small desk by the window, he found a leather journal. Henry hesitated only a moment before opening it. If he was going to risk his life to save this woman, he needed to know what he was dealing with. The entries were dated, starting from 3 weeks ago. Sarah wrote in a clear, elegant hand about her journey west after her father's death, how she had been traveling through the Dakota Territory when her stage had stopped at a way station. She described hearing gunshots in the night, creeping to the window, and seeing 5 men execute the station keeper and his wife in cold blood over some missing money. She had sketched their faces in remarkable detail on the next page. Henry recognized 2 of them immediately, Jack Donovan himself and his brother Cyrus. She wrote about fleeing before dawn, making her way to Miles City, hoping the distance would keep her safe while she decided what to do. The last entry from this morning mentioned that she had finally worked up the courage to write to the territorial marshal in Helena. She had mailed the letter yesterday. Henry closed the journal carefully. So she had not just witnessed a murder, she had reported it. The Donovans must have had someone watching the mail, or perhaps they had a contact in the postal service. Either way, they knew, and they had come for her. He tucked the journal inside his vest and went back downstairs. Mrs. Patterson looked at him with desperate hope. "You're going after her, aren't you? That poor girl, she's got no one. Her father was her only family." "I am," Henry said simply. "If anyone asks, tell them I headed south." "But they went east." "Exactly." He gathered his supplies quickly. Ammunition, dried beef, hardtack, canteens, rope, and an extra blanket. His horse, a sturdy roan gelding named Copper, was already saddled. Henry had lived rough before and knew how to travel light and fast. Within 30 minutes of Sarah's abduction, he was riding out of Miles City, following the clear trail the Donovans had left in the dry summer earth. The sun beat down mercilessly as he pushed Copper into a steady lope. The trail led northeast into broken country, all rocky hills and scattered pine. Henry knew this territory well enough. He had hunted these hills and knew where water could be found. The Donovans were heading toward the Badlands, rough country where a man could disappear for months if he knew where to hide. As the sun began to sink toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and crimson, Henry found their first camp. They had stopped to rest their horses. The ashes were still warm. He counted 4 sets of boot prints and 1 set of smaller prints, Sarah's. She had been allowed to walk around, which was good. It meant they were not planning to kill her immediately. They needed her alive for some reason, probably to find out exactly what she had written in that letter to the marshal. Henry did not make a fire that night. He ate cold jerky and drank sparingly from his canteen, then rolled himself in his blanket under a rocky overhang. Sleep came in fits and starts, his mind replaying the image of Sarah being struck, the sound of her defiant voice. He had only glimpsed her face for a moment, but the impression had burned itself into his memory. High cheekbones, storm-gray eyes, and an expression of fierce determination even in the face of violence. He was up before dawn, back on the trail. The tracks led deeper into the Badlands now, following a dried creek bed through a narrow canyon. This was dangerous country for a lone rider. There were a dozen places where an ambush would be easy. But Henry had one advantage. The Donovans did not know anyone was following them yet. They would be confident, careless even. It was mid-morning on the second day when he found the first real sign that Sarah was still fighting. A piece of torn fabric, the same blue calico from her dress, tied deliberately to a sage brush at head height where it would catch the eye. Henry felt a surge of admiration. She was smart, marking her trail despite whatever threats or violence they might be using to control her. He found 2 more markers over the next few hours, each one telling him he was on the right path. The country grew rougher, all twisted rock formations and steep ravines. Then, as the sun reached its peak, Henry topped a rise and saw it in the distance, an old abandoned ranch house, its walls still standing but the roof partially collapsed. Smoke rose from somewhere behind it. Henry dismounted and approached on foot, leaving Copper tied in a draw where the horse would not be seen. He moved carefully from cover to cover, using every bit of skill he had learned tracking outlaws in Kansas. As he drew closer, he could hear voices, men laughing, and then another sound that made his blood run cold. A woman's cry of pain, quickly cut off. He circled around to approach from the north, where a line of cottonwoods offered concealment. From behind the cover of the trees, he could see the layout clearly now. The old ranch house stood with its back against a cliff face, creating a natural barrier. 3 walls of the house were still intact, though the wood was weathered and splitting. The 4th wall, facing south, had partially collapsed, leaving a gap that had been covered with canvas. 4 horses were tied to a post near what had once been a barn. 4 horses meant at least 4 men, possibly more if some were sharing mounts. Henry settled in to watch and wait, fighting every instinct that screamed at him to charge in. That would just get them both killed. As the afternoon wore on, he mapped the routine. 2 men were always visible, sitting outside playing cards. The other men, presumably inside with Sarah, took turns coming out to smoke or see to the horses. Henry identified all 4, Jack and Cyrus Donovan, plus 2 men he did not recognize, probably recent recruits to their gang. When the sun began to set, Henry made his move. He crept through the lengthening shadows to the cliff face behind the ranch house, finding handholds in the rough rock. It was a difficult climb, but he had done worse. When he reached the top, he could look down into the roofless interior of the house. What he saw made rage bloom hot and bright in his chest. Sarah was tied to a chair in what had once been the main room, her face bruised, her dress torn at the shoulder. But her eyes, those gray eyes, were still blazing with defiance as Jack Donovan crouched in front of her, speaking words Henry could not quite hear. "I will tell you nothing," Sarah's voice drifted up clearly. "You are going to hang for what you did to those people, and nothing you do to me will change that." Jack backhanded her casually, the way a man might swat a fly. "We will see how long that bravery lasts, Miss Garrett. We have all night, and my patience is running thin." Henry forced himself to wait, to think. He could not take on 4 armed men from above, not with Sarah in the line of fire. He needed a better plan. As full darkness fell, he climbed back down and circled around to the eastern side of the house. This wall was solid, but he noticed that the logs were old, rotting in places where water damage had taken its toll. An idea formed. Risky, probably insane, but it might work. Henry returned to where he had left Copper and retrieved his rope and a small hand axe he kept for splitting kindling. Then he made his way back through the darkness, moving with infinite patience. The 2 men who had been playing cards outside had moved inside now, seeking warmth as the temperature dropped. He could hear their voices, muffled but distinct. Henry positioned himself at the eastern wall, at a point where he could see through gaps in the logs into the interior. Sarah was still tied to her chair, but now she was alone. The 4 men gathered around a table on the far side of the room, eating and drinking and arguing about something in low voices. A single lantern provided light. This was his chance. Henry began to work on the wall, using his knife to dig away the rotted wood around one of the lower logs. The sound was masked by the men's conversation and the crackling of their fire. It took nearly an hour, his fingers growing numb from the cold, but finally the log came loose. He carefully set it aside and began on the next one. By midnight, he had created an opening large enough for a person to crawl through. He paused, listening. The voices inside had grown quieter. Through the gaps, he could see that 3 of the men had rolled out their bedrolls and were sleeping. Only Cyrus Donovan remained awake, sitting with his back against the wall, a rifle across his lap, watching Sarah. Henry knew he could not wait any longer. He had no idea what they planned to do with her come morning, and he was not about to find out. He picked up a small stone and, taking careful aim through one of the gaps in the wall, threw it across the room to strike the far wall with a sharp crack. Cyrus jerked upright, his rifle coming up. "What was that?" The other men stirred, grumbling. "Probably just a rat," Jack muttered. "Go check if you are so worried." Cyrus stood, moving toward the sound. As soon as his back was turned, Henry slipped through the hole he had made in the wall, staying low. Sarah saw him immediately, her eyes widening, but she had the sense not to cry out. Henry pressed a finger to his lips and moved toward her, staying in the shadows. He was halfway across the room when his boot came down on a loose board that creaked like a gunshot in the quiet. What the Cyrus spun around, his rifle swinging toward Henry. Henry threw himself forward, drawing his revolver as he moved. He crashed into Sarah's chair, knocking it and her sideways as Cyrus fired. The bullet went wild, slamming into the wall where they had just been. Then all hell broke loose. The other three men scrambled for their weapons as Henry came up in a crouch, his gun bucking in his hand. His first shot took Cyrus in the shoulder, spinning him around. His second went wide as he had to roll away from Jack's return fire. Wood splinters exploded from the floor where he had been. "Get down!" Henry shouted to Sarah, who was struggling on the floor, still tied to the chair. He fired again, keeping the men pinned while he reached Sarah and cut her bonds with his knife. "Can you run?" "Yes," she gasped, her hands coming free. "The hole in the east wall, go now." Sarah did not argue. She scrambled toward the opening Henry had made while he provided covering fire. Jack and one of the other men were returning fire now, their bullets whipping through the air with lethal intent. Henry backed toward the hole, firing methodically, making each shot count. He had just reached the opening when pain exploded across his left arm. He had been grazed, the bullet tearing through his shirt and leaving a burning trail across his bicep. He ignored it, throwing himself through the hole after Sarah just as Jack charged across the room with a roar of rage. "Run!" Henry grabbed Sarah's hand and they ran into the darkness, bullets kicking up dirt around their feet. Behind them, he could hear the men pouring out of the house, shouting. Henry led Sarah in a zigzag pattern through the rocks, making for the draw where he had left Copper. They were 50 yards from the horse when Jack's voice rang out behind them. "Stop or I will shoot the woman." Henry spun, putting himself between Sarah and the pursuers. In the moonlight, he could see Jack and the other two men, Jack's rifle aimed straight at them. Cyrus was nowhere to be seen, probably still back at the house nursing his wounded shoulder. "You are making this harder than it needs to be, friend," Jack called out. "We have got no quarrel with you, just hand over the woman and ride away." "Not happening," Henry said flatly. "Then you are a dead man." Jack's finger tightened on the trigger. The gunshot, when it came, was not from Jack's rifle. It came from somewhere to the left, and Jack went down hard, clutching his leg. The other two men whirled in confusion, trying to find the new threat, and Henry did not waste the opportunity. He fired twice, both shots finding their marks. The two men fell. "Come on," a voice called from the darkness. "This way, quickly." Henry grabbed Sarah's hand again and ran toward the voice. A figure emerged from behind a boulder, an older man with a weathered face and a smoking rifle. "I'm Nathan Cooper, territorial deputy. You Keller?" "I am. How did you?" "Explanations later. We need to move before they recover." Nathan led them at a fast pace through the rocks to where 3 horses waited, including Copper. "I got back to Miles City early and heard what happened. Been following you since yesterday. Lucky I caught up when I did." They mounted quickly, Sarah swinging up behind Henry, her arms wrapping around his waist. They rode hard through the night, putting Miles between themselves and the Donovans. It was not until the first gray light of dawn was touching the eastern horizon that Nathan finally called a halt in a protected box canyon with good sight lines in all directions. Sarah slid from the horse, her legs nearly giving out. Henry caught her, and for a moment they stood there, his hands on her shoulders, her face turned up to his. She was bruised and battered, her dress torn and filthy, but her eyes held his with an intensity that made his breath catch. "You came for me," she said softly. "You do not even know me, and you came." "I could not do anything else," Henry heard himself say. Nathan cleared his throat diplomatically. "I will see to the horses. You two should get some rest. We will head back to Miles City when it is light enough to see any followers." But neither Henry nor Sarah moved. Standing there in the dawn light, Something passed between them, a recognition that went deeper than words. Henry raised a hand slowly and gently touched the bruise on her cheek. Sarah's eyes closed at the contact, and when they opened again, they were bright with tears. "They hurt you," Henry said, his voice rough. "They wanted to know what I told the marshal. They threatened to do much worse if I did not tell them." Sarah's voice trembled slightly, the first sign of fear she had shown. "I was so frightened, but I would not give them the satisfaction of seeing me break." "You are the bravest person I have ever met," Henry said, and he meant it absolutely. "No," Sarah shook her head. "Brave is breaking through walls to save a stranger. Brave is facing 4 armed men alone. I do not even know how to thank you, Mr. Keller." "Henry," he corrected gently, "and you do not need to thank me." "Henry," she repeated, and the way she said his name made something warm unfurl in his chest. "I am Sarah. I know. I read your journal, I am sorry. I needed to understand what I was riding into. Then you know what I saw, what they did to those poor people." Sarah's voice hardened. "They deserve to pay for that, and now they will, thanks to you. We should get you back to town, get those injuries tended to," Henry said, reluctantly stepping back, but Sarah caught his hand. "Wait. Your arm, you are bleeding." She looked at the blood-soaked sleeve of his shirt with alarm. "It is just a graze, nothing serious. Let me see." It was not a request. Sarah was already untying the bandana from around her neck, despite its dirty condition. Henry started to protest, but she gave him a look that brooked no argument, and he found himself sitting on a rock while she carefully rolled up his sleeve. The bullet had carved a furrow across the outside of his bicep, painful but not deep. Sarah's hands were gentle as she cleaned the wound with water from Nathan's canteen and bound it with her bandana. Henry watched her face as she worked, noting the determined set of her jaw, the way her brow furrowed in concentration. She had the most remarkable profile, he thought, strong and elegant all at once. "There," she said, tying off the makeshift bandage. "That should hold until we can get you to a proper doctor." "Thank you." Henry caught her hand before she could pull away. "Sarah, what those men did to you, what they threatened, if you need to talk about it, they hit me," Sarah said quietly. "They threatened me with violence of every kind imaginable, but they did not have time to make good on most of those threats, thanks to you arriving when you did." She met his eyes steadily. "I will carry bruises for a while, but nothing that will not heal. My pride is wounded more than anything else. I hate that they made me feel so helpless." "You are not helpless," Henry said firmly. "You left markers on the trail for anyone following. You refused to tell them what they wanted to know despite the consequences. That is not helpless, Sarah. That is survival." Her eyes softened. "You really mean that?" "Every word." They rode back to Miles City slowly, taking 2 days instead of pushing the horses. Nathan scouted ahead and behind, watching for any sign of pursuit, but the Donovans did not follow. Henry suspected Jack was too busy tending to his wounded leg and brother, and the other 2 men, if they had survived their wounds, would be in no condition to chase anyone. During those 2 days of travel, Henry and Sarah talked. She told him about her life in St. Louis, how she had grown up the daughter of a schoolteacher, inheriting his love of books and learning. How he had died suddenly 6 months ago, leaving her alone in the world. She had decided to come west partly out of grief, partly out of a desire to see something new, to escape the confines of a city that held too many memories. "I thought I would find adventure," she said with a rueful smile as they rode side by side through a meadow filled with late summer wildflowers. "I suppose I found more than I bargained for." "Do you regret coming west?" Henry asked. Sarah was quiet for a moment, considering. "No," she said finally. "Despite everything that has happened, no. The West is beautiful and terrible and vast in a way St. Louis never was. And I have met people here, good people like Mrs. Patterson who gave me a place to stay, the children I was teaching who were so eager to learn. And you." Henry felt his face warm. "I am not much to speak of, just a drifter who never stays anywhere too long." "Why is that?" Sarah asked. "Why do you drift?" It was a fair question, one Henry had asked himself many times. "I suppose I have never found a reason to stay put. I was a deputy in Kansas for a while, but that life felt too confining. I like the freedom of the trail, of knowing I can ride out any time I want and see what is over the next hill." "That sounds lonely," Sarah observed. "It can be," Henry admitted, "but it is also peaceful. I do not have to answer to anyone, do not have to worry about letting people down or having them let me down." "Who let you down, Henry?" The question was gentle, but it cut deep. Henry found himself telling her things he had not spoken of in years. About his father who drank himself to death after Henry's mother died. About the younger sister he had tried to raise who had died of fever when she was only 12. About the weight of responsibility and failure that had driven him west in the first place. "I could not save them," he said quietly. "My mother, my sister. I failed the people who mattered most." Sarah reached across the space between their horses and touched his hand. "You were a child, Henry. What happened to your family was not your fault, but you saved me. Surely that must count for something." "It counts for everything," Henry said, and he realized it was true. The moment he had seen Sarah being taken, something had shifted in him. Some part of himself he thought was dead had roared back to life. He had not been able to save his sister, but he had saved Sarah, and maybe that meant he was not as broken as he had always believed. That night, they camped in a sheltered valley where a spring provided fresh water. Nathan tactfully announced he would take first watch and disappeared into the rocks, leaving Henry and Sarah sitting by the small fire. The night was clear, the stars spread out above them in a glittering carpet. "When I was tied to that chair," Sarah said softly, staring into the flames, "I kept thinking about all the things I had never done, all the experiences I had missed by being too cautious, too afraid. I promised myself that if I survived, I would not waste any more time being careful. Life is too short and too precious." "That is a good promise to make," Henry said. Sarah turned to look at him, the firelight casting shadows across her face. "Henry, I need to tell you something. When you came through that wall, when you risked your life for mine, something changed in me. I know we have only known each other for a few days, and perhaps this is just gratitude or the aftermath of fear, but I need you to know that I feel something for you. Something real." Henry's heart was pounding so hard he thought she must be able to hear it. "Sarah, you do not have to say anything," she interrupted quickly. "I just needed to be honest. No more wasted time, remember, Sarah," Henry said again, more firmly this time. He reached out and gently cupped her face, his thumb brushing over the fading bruise on her cheek. "I feel it too. From the moment I saw you fighting those men, I have not been able to stop thinking about you. It is not just about saving you, although that mattered more than anything. It is who you are, your courage, your fierce heart. I think I started falling for you before we even spoke." The smile that spread across Sarah's face was like sunrise, bright and beautiful and full of warmth. "Really, really," Henry confirmed, and then, because there was nothing else to do, he leaned in and kissed her. It was a gentle kiss, careful of her bruised lip, tender and questioning. Sarah's hand came up to rest against his chest, and he could feel the rapid beating of her heart matching his own. When they finally drew apart, her eyes were shining. "That was worth waiting for," she whispered. They sat together by the fire long into the night, Sarah eventually leaning against Henry's shoulder while he wrapped his arm around her. They talked about everything and nothing, sharing stories and dreams, learning the contours of each other's hearts. When Henry finally suggested they should sleep, Sarah looked up at him with such trust and affection that it took his breath away. "Will you stay with me?" she asked. "Just to sleep, I mean. I do not want to be alone tonight." "I am not going anywhere," Henry promised. They lay down together on his bedroll, Henry's arms around Sarah, her back pressed against his chest. It was the most natural thing in the world, as if they had been doing this for years instead of days. Henry listened to Sarah's breathing slow and deepen as she fell asleep, and felt a peace he had not known since childhood. When they finally rode into Miles City the next afternoon, the town came out to meet them. Mrs. Patterson wept and hugged Sarah so hard Henry thought she might crack a rib. The doctor insisted on examining both of them despite their protests, and everyone wanted to hear the story of the rescue. Nathan Cooper took over the official explanation, describing how he had tracked the Donovans to their hideout and engaged them in a firefight. He mentioned Henry's assistance, but downplayed his role, for which Henry was grateful. The last thing he wanted was to be celebrated as some kind of hero, but Sarah would not let him hide. When Mrs. Patterson asked how she had escaped, Sarah looked straight at Henry and said clearly, "Mr. Keller broke through 3 walls to reach me. He fought 4 armed men to save my life. He is the bravest man I have ever known." The words made Henry uncomfortable, but the way Sarah was looking at him, with open affection and pride, made his discomfort worth it. Over the following days, as Sarah recovered and the territorial marshal arrived to take statements about the Donovan gang, Henry found himself staying in Miles City. He told himself it was just to make sure Sarah was safe, to ensure the Donovans did not try to retaliate. But the truth was simpler and more profound. He did not want to leave her. They spent every day together. Henry took Sarah riding through the hills around town, showing her the secret places he had discovered in his wanderings. She read to him from her books of poetry in the evenings, sitting on Mrs. Patterson's porch while the sun set. They talked about everything, their pasts, their hopes, their fears. One evening, about 2 weeks after the rescue, they were walking along the river that ran past town when Sarah stopped suddenly. "Henry, what happens when this is over? When the trial is done and the Donovans are dealt with? Will you leave?" Henry had been dreading this question because he did not know the answer. His whole life had been about moving on, about never letting himself get too attached. But Sarah had changed everything. The thought of riding away from her felt wrong in a way he could not articulate. "Do you want me to leave?" he asked instead of answering. "No," Sarah said immediately. "I want you to stay, but I know that is not who you are, a man who stays in one place. I would not ask you to change yourself for me. What if I want to change?" The words surprised Henry even as he spoke them. "What if I am tired of drifting? What if I found someone worth staying for?" Sarah's eyes searched his face. "Are you saying what I think you are saying?" "I am saying I love you, Sarah Garrett," Henry said, and it was easier than he had thought it would be, easier than breathing. "I have probably loved you since I saw you fighting those men who took you, and I do not want to drift anymore. I want to stay here with you if you will have me." "If I will have you," Sarah laughed, the sound bright with joy. "Henry Keller, I have been in love with you since you came through that wall like an avenging angel. Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes." Henry pulled her into his arms and kissed her there by the river, with the mountains rising purple in the distance and the water singing over its stones. It felt like coming home after years of wandering, like finding the one place in all the world where he belonged. The trial of the Donovan gang took place in Helena 6 weeks later. Sarah had to testify about what she had witnessed at the way station, and Henry went with her, sitting in the courtroom every day, a steady presence at her side. Her testimony, along with evidence gathered by the territorial marshal, was enough to convict all four men. Jack and Cyrus Donovan were sentenced to hang. The other two men received long prison sentences. On the train ride back to Miles City, Sarah was quiet, staring out the window at the passing landscape. Henry took her hand. "Are you all right?" "I think so," she said slowly. "I am glad they will pay for what they did, but taking the stand, telling the story again, it brought it all back. The fear, the helplessness." "You are the furthest thing from helpless," Henry said firmly. "You stood up there and told the truth, even though it was hard, even though it meant facing those men again. That takes more courage than most people have." Sarah squeezed his hand. "I could do it because you were there. Every time I felt afraid, I just looked at you and remembered that I was not alone anymore, that I have you. You will always have me," Henry promised. They were married in the small church in Miles City on a crisp October morning, with the aspens turning gold on the hillsides and the air smelling of wood smoke and coming winter. Mrs. Patterson cried through the entire ceremony. Nathan Cooper stood up as Henry's best man, grinning like he had personally arranged the whole thing. Half the town turned out. Everyone who had been touched by the story of the schoolteacher from St. Louis and the drifter Cowboy who had broken through walls to save her. Sarah wore a simple dress of ivory silk that Mrs. Patterson and the other women of the town had sewn together as a wedding gift. She carried wildflowers that Henry had picked that morning, riding out before dawn to find the last blooms of the season. When she walked down the aisle toward him, Henry felt his throat tighten with emotion. She was beautiful, but more than that, she was his and he was hers, and the enormity of that truth almost overwhelmed him. "Dearly beloved," the preacher began, but Henry barely heard the words. He was too busy looking at Sarah, at the love shining in her eyes, at the smile playing at the corners of her mouth. When it came time to say his vows, his voice was steady and sure. "I, Henry Keller, take you, Sarah Garrett, to be my wife. I promise to stand by your side through whatever comes, to love you with everything I am, to build a life with you that is worth all the wandering it took to find you." Sarah's eyes were bright with tears as she repeated her own vows. "I, Sarah Garrett, take you, Henry Keller, to be my husband. I promise to be your home and your adventure, your partner in all things, to love you fiercely and without reservation, for all the days of my life." When the preacher finally pronounced them husband and wife, Henry kissed Sarah to the cheers and applause of everyone gathered. It was a kiss full of promise, of hope, of a future that stretched out before them bright and uncharted. They had a small reception at the boarding house, Mrs. Patterson having outdone herself with food and decorations. There was music and dancing, and Henry, who had never been much of a dancer, found himself waltzing with his new wife under paper lanterns strung between the porch posts. "Are you happy?" Sarah asked, her head resting against his shoulder as they swayed to the music. "I did not know I could be this happy," Henry admitted. "I always thought contentment was the best I could hope for, but this, being with you, it is so much more than that. We are going to have a wonderful life together," Sarah said confidently. "I can feel it." They spent their wedding night at the small house Henry had bought on the edge of town, a modest place with good bones that would need work. Sarah did not seem to mind. She walked through the empty rooms with excitement, already planning where furniture would go, talking about curtains and gardens and all the little touches that would make it a home. But that first night, they were too wrapped up in each other to care about empty rooms. They lay together in front of the fireplace on a pile of blankets, learning each other with gentle hands and whispered words. Henry had been with women before, but nothing had prepared him for the intimacy of this, of knowing that Sarah was truly his, that he was truly hers, that they had all the time in the world to explore this new dimension of their relationship. "I love you," Sarah whispered against his neck as they lay tangled together afterward, the firelight casting dancing shadows on the walls. "I love you so much it frightens me sometimes." "Do not be frightened," Henry murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple. "I will always keep you safe, always." As autumn turned to winter, they settled into married life with surprising ease. Henry took a job as a deputy under Nathan Cooper, who had been promoted to sheriff. The work was steady and gave them a good income. Sarah started teaching again, this time in a proper schoolhouse that the town built that fall. She had 8 students of varying ages, and she threw herself into the work with passionate dedication. In the evenings, they worked together on their house, Henry building furniture while Sarah sewed curtains and painted walls. They talked and laughed and sometimes just sat in comfortable silence, content in each other's presence. It was a quiet life, a far cry from the drama of their first meeting, but it was exactly what they both needed. Winter in Montana was harsh, the snow piling high and the temperatures dropping so low that sometimes it hurt to breathe. But their little house was warm and they had each other. Henry had never been happier than those long winter nights, sitting by the fire with Sarah curled against his side, reading aloud from one of her books while the wind howled outside. It was on one such night in January that Sarah set down her book and turned to Henry with a particular expression on her face, something between excitement and nervousness. "Henry, I need to tell you something." He immediately gave her his full attention. "What is it? Are you all right?" "I am more than all right," Sarah said, taking his hand and placing it on her stomach. "Henry, we are going to have a baby." For a moment Henry could not speak. A baby. He was going to be a father. The thought was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. "Are you sure?" "I am sure," Sarah confirmed. "The doctor confirmed it this afternoon. I am about 2 months along. The baby should arrive in late July or early August." Henry pulled her into his arms, holding her tight. "A baby," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "We are going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Sarah asked, pulling back to look at his face. "Happy does not even begin to cover it," Henry said. He cupped her face in his hands and kissed her deeply. "You have given me everything, Sarah. A home, a purpose, and now a family. I do not deserve you." "Stop that," Sarah said, but she was smiling. "We deserve each other, and we are going to be wonderful parents." The months that followed were filled with preparation. They turned the small second bedroom into a nursery, Henry building a cradle from pine wood and sanding it smooth so there would be no splinters. Sarah sewed tiny clothes and blankets, her hands moving with practiced skill. The women of the town threw her a party, showering them with gifts and advice. Henry found himself both excited and terrified. He had failed his own sister, had not been able to protect her when she needed him most. What if he failed his own child? What if something happened to Sarah during the birth? Women died in childbirth all the time, especially out here where medical care was limited. Sarah seemed to sense his fears. One night, as they lay in bed with her swollen belly pressed against his side, she took his hand and placed it where he could feel the baby moving. "Feel that?" she asked. "That is our child, Henry. Strong and healthy, we are going to be fine." "You cannot know that," Henry said quietly. "No," Sarah agreed. "But I choose to believe it anyway, and I need you to believe it too. I need you to trust that we are going to be all right." Henry pressed his face against her neck, breathing in the familiar scent of her. "I will try. I just cannot lose you, Sarah. You are my whole world." "You are not going to lose me," Sarah said firmly. "I am too stubborn to die. Remember, I survived the Donovans. I can survive childbirth." When Sarah went into labor on a sweltering August afternoon, Henry discovered a whole new level of fear. The midwife, a capable woman named Mrs. Reynolds, shoot him out of the bedroom with instructions to boil water and stay out of the way. Henry paced the main room like a caged animal, flinching every time he heard Sarah cry out. Nathan stopped by at some point, trying to distract him with conversation, but Henry could not focus on anything except what was happening in the next room. Hours passed, the sun set, and still the labor continued. Henry was on the verge of breaking down the door when he heard it, the thin, reedy wail of a newborn baby. Mrs. Reynolds emerged a few minutes later, wiping her hands on a towel and smiling broadly. "Congratulations, Mr. Keller. You have a son. Both mother and baby are doing well." Henry nearly collapsed with relief. "Can I see them?" "Of course. Just give me a moment to get them settled." When he finally entered the bedroom, the sight that greeted him made his heart swell to the point of pain. Sarah was propped up against pillows, her hair damp with sweat, her face exhausted but radiant. And in her arms, wrapped in a blue blanket, was the tiniest human being Henry had ever seen. "Come meet your son," Sarah said softly. Henry approached slowly, almost afraid to breathe, and looked down at the baby. His son. The child had a shock of dark hair and a red, scrunched-up face, and Henry fell in love with him instantly. "He is perfect," Henry whispered. "He is," Sarah agreed. "Do you want to hold him?" Henry had never held a baby before, but Sarah showed him how to support the head, how to cradle the tiny body against his chest. The baby settled against him with a little sigh, and Henry felt something fundamental shift inside him. This was his son, his family. The responsibility was enormous, but so was the love. "We should give him a name," Sarah said. "What do you think of James, after your father?" Henry looked at her in surprise. His father had not been a good man, especially not at the end, but Sarah was offering him a chance to reclaim that name, to make it something good again. "James," he repeated slowly. "James Keller, I like it." "James Henry Keller," Sarah corrected with a smile. "He should have part of your name too." Little James grew quickly, going from a tiny bundle to a chubby, curious infant seemingly overnight. Henry threw himself into fatherhood with the same determination he had once devoted to drifting. He changed diapers, walked the floor at night when James was fussy, and felt his heart break wide open every time his son smiled at him. Sarah blossomed as a mother, somehow managing to balance teaching and caring for James with grace. They were exhausted most of the time, but it was the good kind of tired, the kind that came from building something worthwhile. When James was 6 months old, on a cold February evening, Henry and Sarah sat together after putting the baby to bed. Sarah was mending a shirt while Henry carved a small wooden horse for James to play with when he got older. It was a scene of such domestic contentment that Henry sometimes had to remind himself it was real, that this was truly his life now. "I have been thinking," Sarah said, not looking up from her sewing. "We should buy the old Parker place." Henry looked up in surprise. The Parker place was a small ranch about 5 miles outside town, with good grazing land and a decent house. Old Mr. Parker had died last year, and his widow was looking to sell. "That is a big step. Are you sure you want to leave town?" "I think it would be good for us," Sarah said. "James should grow up with space to run, with animals and fresh air. And you could raise horses. I know you have always wanted to do that. We could make a real go of it, Henry. Build something lasting." Henry considered this. She was right. He had always loved horses and had often thought about breeding and training them. And the idea of having their own land, of building a legacy for James, was appealing. "It would take all our savings and then some." "I know," Sarah said, "but I think it is worth the risk. What do you say, Cowboy? Ready for one more adventure?" Henry set down his carving and pulled Sarah into his lap, kissing her soundly. "With you, always." They bought the Parker place that spring, throwing themselves into the work of turning it into a working ranch. It was hard, back-breaking labor, but they were young and strong and deeply in love, and that made all the difference. Henry proved to have a gift for training horses, and within a year, people from all over the territory were coming to buy horses from the Keller ranch. Sarah transformed the house into a real home, filling it with warmth and light. She continued teaching, now taking in a few students at the ranch rather than working at the town school. James thrived in the country setting, growing into a sturdy, fearless toddler who followed his father everywhere. On their third wedding anniversary, Henry and Sarah stood on the porch of their ranch house watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple. James was playing at their feet with the wooden horse Henry had carved, making clip-clop sounds and laughing at his own cleverness. "Do you ever miss it?" Sarah asked, leaning against Henry's shoulder. The drifting, the freedom of the trail. Henry thought about it honestly before answering. "Sometimes I miss the simplicity of it, just me and my horse and the open road, but I would not trade this for anything. This is what I was searching for all those years, I just did not know it. A home, a family, a reason to stay." "I am glad you stayed," Sarah said softly. "I am glad you broke through those walls to save me." "I would do it again in a heartbeat," Henry said. "Every single time." 2 years later, Sarah gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Emma. She had Sarah's gray eyes and Henry's dark hair, and she wrapped both her parents completely around her tiny finger from the moment she arrived. James, now 4 years old, took his role as big brother very seriously, always wanting to help with the baby. The ranch continued to prosper. Henry hired on a couple of hands to help with the work, and they added cattle to their horse operation. Sarah published a series of articles about life in Montana that were picked up by newspapers back east, earning enough money to add on to the house and buy more land. When Emma was 2 and James was 6, Sarah told Henry she was pregnant again. This time, she gave birth to twin boys, which sent the household into loving chaos. Henry often joked that he was outnumbered, 4 children and Sarah against him, but the truth was he loved every minute of it. His house was full of laughter and noise and life, everything his childhood home had lacked. The years passed in a blur of children growing, seasons changing, and the ranch expanding. Henry taught all the children to ride, to respect the land, to work hard and love deeply. Sarah taught them to read and think and question, filling their minds with knowledge and their hearts with compassion. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Henry and Sarah took a rare evening alone, riding out to a high meadow where they could see for miles in every direction. The grass was thick with wildflowers, and the setting sun turned everything golden. 10 years, Sarah said wonderingly. "It seems like yesterday and a lifetime ago all at once." "The best 10 years of my life," Henry said. He dismounted and helped Sarah down, then pulled her into his arms. "I love you more now than I did the day we married, and I loved you pretty fiercely then." "I know," Sarah said, smiling up at him. "I can feel it every day in every look, every touch, every moment we share. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Henry Keller." They made love there in the meadow, slow and tender, taking their time in a way they rarely could with 4 children in the house. Afterward, they lay in the grass watching the stars come out, talking about everything and nothing, content in each other's presence. "Do you think the children suspect where we went?" Sarah asked lazily. "Oh, I am sure Mrs. Patterson figured it out when we asked her to watch them for the evening," Henry said with a laugh. Mrs. Patterson still lived in Miles City, though she was older now and had sold the boarding house. She adored the Keller children and was always happy to watch them. "We should probably get back," Sarah said reluctantly. before James tries to cook dinner and burns down the kitchen. They rode home hand in hand, their horses walking side by side through the darkness. When they arrived, they found the house still standing, all 4 children asleep in various rooms and Mrs. Patterson dozing in a chair by the fire. She woke when they came in and smiled knowingly at them. "Have a good ride?" she asked. "The best," Sarah said, hugging the older woman. "Thank you for watching them." After Mrs. Patterson left, Henry and Sarah checked on each child, tucking in blankets and pressing kisses to foreheads. In their own room, they undressed slowly, comfortable in the ritual of a decade together. In bed, Sarah curled against Henry's side, her head on his chest. "Henry," she said quietly, "do you ever think about that first day, when you saw me being taken?" "All the time," Henry admitted. "It was the day my life truly started, even though I did not realize it then." "What if you had not come after me?" Sarah asked. "What if you had decided it was not your problem?" "That was never an option," Henry said firmly. "From the moment I saw you fighting, I knew I had to help. It was not even a choice, really. It was just something I had to do." "Fate," Sarah murmured. "Maybe it was always meant to be this way. You were meant to save me, we were meant to find each other." "I do not know about fate," Henry said, "but I know I am grateful for every moment that led me to you, even the hard ones." As the years continued to pass, the Keller Ranch became a fixture in the territory, known for quality horses and the hospitality of its owners. Henry and Sarah's children grew strong and capable, each one inheriting their parents' best qualities. James became an excellent horseman, taking over more of the ranch work as he got older. Emma inherited her mother's love of learning and her father's quiet strength. The twins, who they had named Daniel and Matthew, were inseparable partners in mischief and adventure. When James turned 18, he met a young woman from a neighboring ranch named Mary, and Henry saw in his son's eyes the same look he had once worn when meeting Sarah. The wedding took place at the ranch on a perfect June day, and as Henry walked his son's bride down the aisle, standing in for her deceased father, he felt the circle of life continuing. Emma went east to college, the first in either family to do so. But she came home every summer, bringing with her stories of city life and new ideas. She eventually married a doctor and settled in Miles City, close enough to visit regularly but far enough to have her own life. The twins grew into strapping young men who loved the ranch life and showed no inclination to leave. They expanded the operation, adding more cattle and even starting a small timber business on the forested parts of their land. Henry and Sarah aged together, their hair turning gray, their faces lining with the marks of years lived well. But the love between them never dimmed. If anything, it grew deeper, richer, informed by decades of shared experiences, of weathering storms together, of building a life from nothing. On a warm evening in early September, when Henry was 53 and Sarah 51, they sat on the porch of their ranch house watching their grandchildren play in the yard. James and Mary had 3 children now, and Emma had just given them 2 more. The house was full of noise and laughter, just as it had been when their own children were young. "We did all right, did we not?" Sarah said, her hand finding Henry's as naturally as breathing. "We did better than all right," Henry said. "We built something good here, something lasting." "I was thinking today about that girl who got taken from Miles City all those years ago," Sarah said reflectively. "About how terrified she was, how certain she was going to die. If I could go back and tell her how it would all turn out, I am not sure she would believe me." "Would you change anything?" Henry asked. "If you could go back, would you do anything differently?" Sarah thought about it seriously before answering. "No, not one single thing. Even the scary parts, even the pain, it was all necessary to get us here. And here is exactly where I want to be." "Me too," Henry said. He raised her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently. "You are still the most beautiful woman I have ever seen, you know that. You are biased," Sarah said, but she was smiling. "Absolutely," Henry agreed, "and I always will be." As the sun set over the mountains they had called home for so many years, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Henry reflected on the journey that had brought them here. From that desperate ride into the Badlands, through breaking through walls both literal and metaphorical, to this moment of perfect contentment, it had been a life worth living. He had started as a drifter with no roots and no purpose, running from his own painful past. But Sarah had changed everything. She had given him a reason to stay, a reason to fight, a reason to believe that he deserved happiness. And in saving her, he had somehow saved himself. The grandchildren eventually went inside, called by their mothers for baths and bed. The house glowed with warm lamplight, and Henry could hear the cheerful chaos of a large family preparing for sleep. Sarah rested her head on his shoulder with a contented sigh. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "Just how lucky I am," Henry said. "How one moment, one decision to go after a woman I did not even know changed everything. I could have stayed in that livery stable. I could have let someone else deal with it. But I did not, and that has made all the difference." "You could never have stayed," Sarah said with certainty. "It is not in your nature to stand by when someone needs help. That is one of the reasons I fell in love with you." "One of the reasons?" Henry raised an eyebrow. "What were the others?" Sarah laughed. "Your stubborn courage, your gentle hands, the way you looked at me like I was the only person in the world who mattered. The way you broke through 3 walls and faced down 4 armed men without hesitation. Should I go on?" "Please do," Henry said, grinning. "I like hearing this." "You are still fishing for compliments after 27 years of marriage," Sarah teased. "Very well. You are kind without being weak, strong without being cruel, and you have been the most wonderful husband and father I could have imagined. You gave me a life of adventure and security, excitement and peace, all at once. Is that enough?" "It is perfect," Henry said, kissing her temple. "Just like you." They sat in comfortable silence for a while longer, listening to the night sounds of the ranch, horses nickering in the barn, the distant howl of a coyote, the rustle of wind through the pines. Inside, the house gradually quieted as everyone settled in for the night. "Do you remember what you said to me on our wedding night?" Sarah asked suddenly. "When we were lying by the fire." "I said a lot of things that night," Henry replied, his voice warm with memory. "You said you would always keep me safe," Sarah reminded him. "And you have, Henry. For 27 years you have kept that promise. Even when the threat was not bandits or outlaws, even when it was just the ordinary struggles of life, you have always been there, keeping me safe." "And you have done the same for me," Henry said. "You saved me just as much as I saved you, Sarah. Maybe more. You gave me a home when I had been running for so long I forgot what home felt like. You gave me a family, a purpose, a reason to be better than I thought I could be." "We saved each other," Sarah said simply. "That is what love does." As the years continued to roll by, Henry and Sarah settled into the rhythms of older age with grace. They took daily walks around the ranch, hand in hand, watching the seasons change and the land they loved transform from green to gold to white and back again. They spoiled their grandchildren shamelessly and offered wisdom to their adult children when asked. Henry taught his grandsons to train horses with patience and respect. Sarah taught her granddaughters to read and think critically, just as she had once taught their parents. They shared stories of the old days, of Miles City when it was wilder and rougher, of the dramatic rescue that had brought them together. The grandchildren never tired of hearing about how Grandpa Henry had broken through 3 walls to save Grandma Sarah from the bad men. Henry always downplayed his role, but Sarah made sure the children knew exactly how brave their grandfather had been, how he had risked everything for a woman he had only seen from a distance. "That is true love," she would tell them. "Not the easy kind that happens when everything is perfect, but the kind that makes you brave, that pushes you to do impossible things for the people you love." On their 40th wedding anniversary, the family threw them a massive celebration at the ranch. It seemed like half of Montana showed up, old friends and neighbors, people whose lives Henry and Sarah had touched over the decades. There was music and dancing, food and laughter, and speeches that made both of them tear up. Nathan Cooper, now retired and white-haired but still sharp as ever, stood up to make a toast. "I have known Henry and Sarah for 40 years now, since the day I helped Henry track down the men who took her. I have watched them build a life together from nothing, watched them raise fine children and create a legacy that will last for generations. They are proof that true love exists, that it is worth fighting for, and that when you find it, you hold on with everything you have got. To Henry and Sarah." "To Henry and Sarah," the crowd echoed, raising their glasses. That night, after everyone had gone home and the house was quiet, Henry and Sarah lay in their bed, too excited to sleep despite their exhaustion. Through the open window, they could hear the familiar sounds of the ranch at night. 40 years, Sarah mused. Where did the time go? Into this, Henry said, gesturing vaguely at the house, the ranch, the life they had built. Into our children and grandchildren, into every sunrise we watched together, every meal we shared, every moment of laughter and tears and everything in between. Would you do it again? Sarah asked. If you could go back to the beginning, knowing everything that would happen, would you still break through those walls? Henry turned to face her, his hand coming up to cup her cheek in a gesture he had performed thousands of times over the years. Sarah, I would break through 1,000 walls to get to you. I would do it all again, exactly the same way, because every moment, good and bad, led us here. And here is exactly where I want to be. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, the good kind, the kind that came from a heart too full to contain all the emotion. I love you, Henry Keller. I have loved you for 40 years, and I will love you for however many years we have left. Forever then, Henry said, kissing her softly. Because our love is the kind that does not end, even when everything else does. As they drifted off to sleep in each other's arms, just as they had done for 40 years, Henry reflected on the incredible journey of his life. He had started as a man running from his past, convinced he did not deserve happiness or love. But Sarah had shown him otherwise. She had taught him that bravery was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it. That love was not a weakness, but the greatest strength a person could have. The years continued to be kind to them. Henry maintained his health well into his 70s, still riding out to check on the horses every day, still walking hand in hand with Sarah around their land. Sarah remained sharp and engaged, writing her memoirs and corresponding with her grandchildren who had scattered across the territories and states. They celebrated 50 years of marriage surrounded by 4 generations of family. James gave a speech that had everyone in tears, talking about how his parents had shown him what a real partnership looked like, how they had faced every challenge together, never wavering in their commitment to each other. Emma read a poem she had written about her parents' love, about a cowboy who had broken through walls to save a woman, and in doing so, had found himself. The twins, now successful ranchers in their own right, presented their parents with a hand-carved bench to place on their favorite spot overlooking the valley. As Henry and Sarah sat on that bench later, watching the sun set over their land, surrounded by the evidence of a life well lived, Henry felt a profound sense of peace. He had done what he set out to do all those years ago. He had saved Sarah. But more than that, he had loved her, cherished her, built a life with her that was worth every struggle, every sacrifice, every moment of doubt. "What are you thinking?" Sarah asked, her voice softer now with age but still carrying that note of curiosity that had first charmed him. "I am thinking that I am the luckiest man who ever lived," Henry said. "I am thinking that breaking through those walls was the easiest decision I ever made, because it brought me to you." "It brought us to each other," Sarah corrected gently. "I was just as lost as you were, Henry. Just in a different way. You were running from your past and I was trying to figure out my future. We found each other at exactly the right moment." "Fate," Henry said, echoing a conversation they had had decades ago. "Love," Sarah replied. "Fate might have brought us together, but love kept us together. Our choice to fight for this, to work for this, to cherish this every single day. That is what made all the difference." As the stars began to appear overhead, one by one filling the darkening sky, Henry pulled Sarah closer. She fit against his side as perfectly now as she had on their wedding night, as if they had been designed to complete each other. And perhaps they had been. Perhaps somewhere in the grand design of the universe, it had been written that a drifting cowboy would save a stolen woman, and in doing so would find his home. The ranch continued to thrive under the management of their sons and son-in-law. Henry and Sarah gradually stepped back from the daily operations, content to offer advice when asked and spend their days enjoying the life they had built. They took up the hobbies they had never had time for. Henry returned to wood carving, creating intricate figurines for his great-grandchildren. Sarah painted watercolors of the Montana landscape she had come to love so deeply. On warm afternoons, they would sit on their porch, Henry carving while Sarah painted, occasionally looking up to share a thought or a memory. They did not need many words anymore. After more than 50 years together, they could communicate with just a look, a touch, a smile. Their health remained remarkably good, but they were realistic about the passing of time. They made sure all their affairs were in order, that their children knew their wishes, that nothing would be left unresolved when the time came. But they did not dwell on endings. Instead, they focused on making the most of every day they had left together. On a clear morning in late spring, when Henry was 78 and Sarah 76, they took their daily walk around the ranch. The mountains were still capped with snow, but the valley was green and lush, dotted with wildflowers. They walked slowly now, taking their time, stopping often to admire the view or catch their breath. "You know what I was thinking about this morning?" Sarah asked as they paused beside the creek that ran through their property. "What were you thinking about?" Henry asked, his arm around her waist, supporting her as much as embracing her. "I was thinking about the first time we kissed, by the campfire on our way back to Miles City. Do you remember?" "Of course I remember," Henry said. "I was terrified I was going to mess it up, that you would realize you did not actually want to be with some broken-down drifter." "I never thought of you as broken down," Sarah said firmly. "I thought you were the most heroic, handsome, wonderful man I had ever met, and I was right." "You made me better," Henry said quietly. "Everything good in my life came from loving you." They stood there by the creek for a long time, listening to the water burble over rocks, feeling the warm sun on their faces, content in a way that only two people who had shared a lifetime together could be. When Henry passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 82, surrounded by his family, his hand was clasped in Sarah's. She had been with him at the end, just as she had been with him through everything else, telling him how much she loved him, thanking him for the beautiful life they had shared, promising that she would be fine. But those who knew Sarah understood that a piece of her had gone with Henry. She continued to live for another 3 years, staying active and engaged with her family, but everyone could see that she was just marking time, waiting to be reunited with the man who had broken through walls to save her, the man who had given her a life beyond her wildest dreams. She passed away quietly one autumn afternoon, sitting in her favorite chair on the porch, looking out over the ranch. They found her with a smile on her face, and clutched in her hand was a worn photograph from their wedding day. 2 young people blazing with love and hope and possibility. They were buried side by side on a hillside overlooking the ranch, beneath 2 old pine trees that had been saplings when they first arrived. Their children commissioned a simple stone marker that read, Henry Keller, 1855–1937, Sarah Garrett Keller, 1857–1940, he broke through walls to save her. She gave him a reason to stay. Together they built a legacy of love. The Keller Ranch continued for generations, passed down through their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. The story of Henry and Sarah became family legend, told and retold to each new generation. The tale of how a cowboy had broken through 3 walls and a locked door to save the woman who had been taken from town, and how that single act of courage had blossomed into a love that had lasted a lifetime and created a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the wind whispered through the pines and the sun painted the mountains gold, people swore they could feel the presence of those 2 souls still lingering on the land they had loved, still walking hand in hand through the valleys and hills of the ranch they had built together. Their love as enduring as the mountains themselves, as constant as the turning of the seasons, as eternal as the Montana sky. The family that gathered every year for reunions on the ranch, now spanning 5 and 6 generations from Henry and Sarah's original union, never forgot the lesson their ancestors had taught them. That true love was worth fighting for, that courage meant acting even when you were afraid, and that the greatest legacy anyone could leave was not wealth or property, but the example of a life lived with integrity, purpose, and devotion. Henry and Sarah's great-great-grandchildren played in the same meadows where Henry had first kissed Sarah. Road horses descended from the stock Henry had so carefully bred, and learned to read from books that had once belonged to Sarah's small library. The ranch house, expanded and modernized over the years, but still retaining its original core, stood as a testament to what 2 people could build when they chose to invest in each other and in the future. On the wall of the main parlor hung a painting that Emma had commissioned late in her life, showing a young Henry breaking through a wooden wall, his face determined and fierce, reaching toward a woman who was reaching back toward him with equal intensity. It was a romanticized version of events, but it captured the essential truth of their story. 2 souls finding each other across impossible odds, choosing to fight for that connection, and building something beautiful from that choice. The legacy of Henry and Sarah Keller was not just the prosperous ranch or the large family they had created. It was the example they had set of what love could be when it was tended and treasured, when 2 people committed themselves fully to each other and to the life they were building together. It was proof that one moment of courage, one decision to act instead of standing by, could ripple outward through time, touching lives that had not even been born yet, creating beauty and meaning that would last long after the original actors had left the stage. And so the story ended where all the best stories end, not with death, but with legacy. Not with an ending, but with a continuation. Henry had broken through walls to reach Sarah, but together they had built something far stronger than any wall. a love that transcended time, a family that would carry their values forward, and a reminder that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is to open their heart and fight for love. No matter the cost, no matter the obstacles, no matter what walls need to be broken through along the way.